Interviews for the Jets offensive coordinator job are underway. Earlier this week, former Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett interviewed for the job. I don't think he's the right guy for the position, and I'll explain why, and talk about some other candidates who might be better fits today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, January 19th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. Helps the channel out tremendously. So does giving this episode a big thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. And first-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's PrizePicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. Well, as you're probably aware, the Jets are looking for a new offensive coordinator. Mike LaFleur last week, it was announced that he's not returning to the team. It sounds like LaFleur probably is going to end up on the Los Angeles Rams coaching staff with Sean McVay, so there is a vacancy for the New York Jets to fill, and interviews are underway to fill it. Head coach Robert Saleh indicated it'd probably take a couple of weeks. Reports have indicated they're going to interview a number of candidates. Now, yesterday, a big name candidate was announced, and it's former Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett, who lasted less than 1 year as Broncos head coach, a longtime NFL offensive coordinator. He'd been the coordinator of the Buffalo Bills for a couple of years under Doug Marrone, then coordinator of the Jacksonville Jaguars again under Marrone, and most recently he had been the Packers offensive coordinator under Matt LaFleur, Mike LaFleur's brother, for 3 years, where he worked with Aaron Rodgers. Interesting candidate from a couple standpoints. Now, first of all, he is a former NFL head coach, and generally speaking, even if you're a bad NFL head coach, you got the job because you were an outstanding coordinator. I don't know that that's necessarily the case with Nathaniel Hackett. I think Nathaniel Hackett may have been a guy who kind of got the job because of his relationship with Aaron Rodgers, and I think that when the Broncos hired him, the relationship with Rodgers mattered for a couple of reasons. First of all, NFL teams like to hire head coaches who were coordinators on good teams, and the Packers were good for 3 years while Hackett was their offensive coordinator, and we know that they were good because of Aaron Rodgers. And the Adam Gase experience, if it's taught us anything, it's that just being around a great quarterback does not necessarily mean you're a great coach. You could be an assistant coach who just happens to be in the right place at the right time, like Adam Gase was with Peyton Manning in Denver, and that can help you get big-time jobs. And it doesn't always mean that you're a great coach. It doesn't always mean that you're qualified to be a head coach. But the Denver thing took it to the next step, because this time last year, it was not clear that Aaron Rodgers was going to be back in Green Bay for the 2022 season. There was a lot of speculation that he was going to seek a trade, and he had a relationship with Nathaniel Hackett that, by all accounts, was a good relationship. The Broncos were viewed as one of the top contenders to get Rodgers in the event he was traded. So it seems like, as much as anything, the Broncos hired him because they felt like that was a shortcut to getting Aaron Rodgers, to convince Aaron Rodgers that Denver's the team you want to come to. And I think that theory really played itself out by the way the Broncos treated Hackett, because they could not get rid of him fast enough. Usually, even if you have a coach who's one and done, you're not going to fire him before the end of the season. I mean, I think that the fact they got rid of him just showed that a lot of the rationale was they thought Hackett was going to be their ticket to Aaron Rodgers, and it did not work out. Now, of course, there's going to be all speculation this offseason about Rodgers as well. I think it would be very difficult for Green Bay to trade him at this point. I would not expect it. And I already heard the rumors, yesterday when the news broke that Hackett was a potential candidate for the Jets, or was a candidate and had interviewed for the job. All this speculation, well, Hackett's going to bring Aaron Rodgers. Did you not see how that worked out for Denver this year? I talked about this on the show recently, that you should not hire a coordinator based on the idea he's going to lure a quarterback here. And actually, I was speaking more specifically about a guy, Greg Olson, who had a relationship with Derek Carr. You don't know what quarterback you're going to get. So I think that should not be a rationale for any sort of hire. Another reason that this is interesting is the Hackett family has a history with the New York Jets, running New York Jets offenses. Paul Hackett, Nathaniel Hackett's father, was the Jets offensive coordinator under Herman Edwards between 2001 and 2004. Now, I have not been watching the Jets as long as many of you. I know we have listeners to this podcast who go back to Super Bowl III. They go back to the 60s, the early days of the franchise. So I have not been following the Jets as long as you have. But, I'll get to the point where I've been following this team for about 30 years. And I've seen a lot of very unpopular offensive coordinators, all the way up to Mike LaFleur, who were heavily criticized. In the years I've been following the Jets, I don't think I've ever seen a less popular coordinator than Paul Hackett was, and with good reason. And if the Locked On Jets podcast was around in the 2001 to 2004 years, I can tell you that we would have a lot of episodes with me complaining about Paul Hackett, because he was a horrible, horrible coordinator. Now, if you liked runs on 3rd and 8, Paul Hackett was your man. That was your guy. If you liked offenses that did not have any sort of shotgun formations, Paul Hackett was your guy. Now, that was less... saying that today makes it sound ridiculous because every team runs the shotgun. It was not quite as prevalent in the NFL in those days. There were many more snaps under center than there are today. But even in 2001 to 2004, an offense that lacked any sort of shotgun formations was kind of a dinosaur. It was, even if it wasn't as prevalent as it was today. I don't think that this should be a factor in the decision, because ultimately, you can't blame the son for the father's sins. And I don't think it's fair to say that Nathaniel Hackett's necessarily going to be as bad as his father, just because his dad was bad. These are two different people. I think, I don't think I'm exactly the same person as my father. I don't think anybody's the same person exactly as their parents. People should be judged on their own merits. So I don't think that should be a factor. I will say this. If the Jets hire Nathaniel Hackett, Joe Beningo rants are going to be amazing, because Joe Beningo was probably the biggest critic of Paul Hackett out there, and there were many. And I think the idea of, if you ever follow the WFAN host Joe Beningo, who has really entertaining rants about the Jets, he gets really upset when the Jets lose. It's going to be really entertaining if Nathaniel Hackett's hired and they have a bad game on offense, because Beningo already has frustrations built in from the Paul Hackett days with this family. I think the issue I have is I just don't think Hackett makes much sense as a coordinator. I just don't think he's that good of a coordinator. And that goes back to what I said just a few minutes ago. Usually when a head coach gets hired, it's because they're a good coordinator. Hackett really got hired based on his relationship with Aaron Rodgers. What can I say in his favor? Well, I can say a couple things. First of all, he and Doug Marrone went back to the days when Doug Marrone was the head coach at Syracuse University. And I will say that they were early adopters of plays that they were kind of like the early versions of run-pass options. So you do see a little bit of openness to new ideas there. The other thing I'd say is that Hackett's best offense, if we take out the Aaron Rodgers years, and look, I could have been Aaron Rodgers' offensive coordinator in those years and probably had the same level of success. But beyond that, Hackett was not calling the plays. Matt LaFleur was calling the plays in Green Bay, so he wasn't even the play caller. So if we take those out, the best offense he engineered was the 2017 Jaguars. That was a team that almost went to the Super Bowl. And there are some legitimate similarities to this Jets team when you talk about the strong run game. When you have Breece Hall, they had Leonard Fournette in Fournette's rookie season, when Fournette was maybe Fournette's best season, where he actually looked like he was going to live up to the promise. And that was a team that leaned on a strong defense. So a similar team construction to Hackett's best offense. But you look at the record, it's very undistinguished, and it's a little bit dangerous to look at rankings because, you have to consider other factors. You have to consider personnel. Like, for example, Hackett being the offensive coordinator of some top-ranked offenses in Green Bay, not super relevant when you have Aaron Rodgers. But, I mean, if you watch that Denver offense, there's nothing exciting about it. It was not a well-constructed offense. It was not really an offense that was built to the strengths of its players. And this is I think this has been an ongoing issue with Nathaniel Hackett through his career, where I remember he was on that Marrone staff in Buffalo, and I distinctly remember when Marrone left Buffalo with Hackett being happy, because I was upset because I wanted them to stay in Buffalo because I never thought they were going to build the Bills into much of anything. I just, even though he was an early adopter of package plays, which, again, the early versions of run-pass options, I don't think I saw a lot of creativity. He had some good playmakers in Buffalo. I don't think he utilized them all that spectacularly. I've never looked at an offense that he's run, an offense that he's legitimately run, if we throw out the Matt LaFleur, Aaron Rodgers offense, and felt like he got the most out of them. So I think that this would be a shaky hire, and he's got a bad reputation now because the Denver situation has really, I think, damaged his reputation in NFL fan bases. And if you saw the reaction yesterday among fans, not just Jets fans in the NFL, there's a big aversion to this hire. I don't know if I'd go as far as those, but I don't think he's the right guy for this job because I don't see what he brings to the table that would make this offense better. I try not to take stances that are too big on coordinators because, again, I think what the Jets do at the quarterback position is going to matter a lot more than the coordinator they hire, but this would be the one where I'd look at it and say, I don't know what the Jets are doing here. I think this is a shaky hire. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'll talk about somebody who I think is a little bit better, and he's a coach on the Eagles. Jets are interested in a number of coaches on the Eagles staff, but there's one that stands out to me who doesn't have a lot of experience, but I think could be an intriguing name. I'll tell you who it is, and I'll tell you why I like him as we continue this Thursday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by BetOnline. We are approaching one of the best football weekends of the year. These 3 weekends before the Super Bowl, I think, are amazing. Last weekend, we had Super Wild Card weekend where we had 6 games. This weekend, we have the top 8 teams in the league playing, with all due respect to some of the teams that lost, some of the higher-seeded teams that lost. 4 great games. Next weekend, we have Conference Championship Sunday, where 2 championships will be decided. And even though the Jets are not in any of these games, if you want to make some money, you can always go to BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From pro football to basketball to hockey, they've got it all at betonline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, and of course you do because you're listening to Locked On Jets, you can find those at BetOnline as well. They are the fastest and easiest way to get all of your betting info, so head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. We're talking Jets offensive coordinator candidates today. In the first segment, I talked about Nathaniel Hackett, not my favorite candidate. I'll tell you a guy who's emerged who I'm intrigued by, and this is always a tricky venture when we're talking about figuring out which candidates are the best for a coordinator position. It especially becomes difficult when we have guys who really don't have coordinator experience because being a good position coach doesn't necessarily translate to being a good coordinator. In the same way, being a good coordinator does not necessarily translate to being a good head coach. And it's also difficult to evaluate position coach caliber because sometimes we look at whether this guy's players have had success or failure. It's not always directly related to their position coach. Sometimes a guy's just really good, and he's going to be good no matter who his position coach is. Sometimes a guy's really bad, and he's just going to be really bad no matter who his position coach is. And I really am of the mindset that there's a small percentage of coaches at the top of the profession who make a legitimate positive difference. There's a small percentage at the very bottom who just destroy everything they touch. They could be handed a great situation and destroy it. I think the vast majority of the coaches are somewhere in the middle where if you give them good players, they'll succeed. You give them bad players, they'll fail. Some years they'll beat expectations. Some years they'll come up short of expectations. But at the end of the day, they don't really move the needle that much. But there's one candidate who's been mentioned who I think is interesting. Now, the Jets are really kind of focused on the Philadelphia Eagles. There are 3 candidates off the Eagles coaching tree who have been mentioned. One is Marcus Brady, who was actually the Colts offensive coordinator at the start of the year, but he was fired mid-season. The Colts made a lot of coaching changes mid-season. Frank Reich was fired. Marcus Brady was fired as well, and he signed on with the Eagles as a consultant. Another guy who's a candidate is Kevin Patullo, who is their passing game coordinator. He actually is a name that might be familiar to you if you're a Jets fan because he was briefly the Jets quarterbacks coach for 2 years under Chan Gailey and Todd Bowles, 2015-2016. But the guy I really have my eye on is the Eagles, he's currently the Eagles quarterbacks coach. His name is Brian Johnson. And if you're a longtime college football fan, you may remember this guy was the quarterback of the Utah Utes. He was actually the quarterback back during an undefeated season they had in 2008, and they actually beat Nick Saban's Alabama team in the Sugar Bowl. Some kind of a memorable team. He went into coaching, and he has a pretty impressive track record if you look at him, because he went into coaching. His first stop was at Utah, where he had a couple jobs. Then he went to Mississippi State, and he was the quarterbacks coach at a time where Mississippi State had Dak Prescott. And again, this gets a little tricky because, especially when a quarterback pans out, there tends to be, a success of a quarterback tends to have 1,000 fathers. And Dak Prescott was a fourth-round pick who clearly developed in his time with the Dallas Cowboys. But still a rather impressive note on your resume if you were Dak Prescott's quarterbacks coach in college, because Dak Prescott did enter the league, and look, he's had success as a rookie. He was ready to play. So, it's a little bit, I don't know that Brian Johnson's necessarily the definitive reason for it, but again, a nice note on your resume. Then Johnson followed, he had a brief stint in Houston, then he went to Florida, at the University of Florida. He worked under head coach Dan Mullen, just as he did at Mississippi State. He was their quarterbacks coach for a couple of years again. Then he was their offensive coordinator in the year 2020, where, and again, this gets really dangerous, because as much as stats can be misleading when we're talking about offensive coordinators in the NFL, in college they can be even more misleading, because especially at a school like Florida, you have a huge talent advantage when your team's good. So, it's not always the coaching, but by all accounts, they've had a pretty productive offense that year. And no matter what you think of Kyle Trask did turn into a legitimate NFL draft prospect under Brian Johnson's watch. Johnson then went to the Philadelphia Eagles. He's obviously been working under Nick Sirianni the last couple of years as the quarterbacks coach, and Jalen Hurts has improved quite a bit. Now, how much of that is Brian Johnson, I don't know, but you start to see a trend here that Brian Johnson, where he goes, there tends to be good results for the quarterback. And I'm not saying that you're hiring him to fix Zach Wilson, but some impressive, at least on paper, superficially, results. I also like that he's been exposed to some different offenses. He's been exposed to some of the modern spread offenses working under Dan Mullen in college. Now, Nick Sirianni, who I think is a good offensive mind, with the Colts. I'm sorry, Sirianni was with the Colts. Now he's with the Eagles. So, to me, Brian Johnson is an intriguing candidate, because I like the fact that he's been exposed to all these different things. I like the body of work when we're talking about the quarterback position. I think that, it's always difficult to say who's going to succeed stepping up from a position coach to a coordinator role. It doesn't always work out. Sometimes there are guys who look like great candidates on paper. And I do get the element that you just hired a guy who's young and inexperienced in Mike LaFleur. It's a little bit odd to go with another young, inexperienced guy. But as I said a couple of days ago, Jets don't need a certain level of experience. Just hiring the most experienced candidate out there after Mike LaFleur is not necessarily going to fix the offense. You need to find the right guy. And if we're talking about a guy who's stepping up from a position coach role into a coordinator role, there are certain things I look for. And they're the things I just talked about. Do you have, at least on paper, a track record of success? Have you been exposed to a lot of different concepts? Have you been exposed to new offensive concepts? And Brian Johnson, I think, checks a lot of these boxes. Now, the challenge is that this is not necessarily going to be the easiest job to sell, because, first of all, you don't have a quarterback. And the Jets can give you their plan. Look, I'm sure the Jets are going to roll out that they have a plan at quarterback. This is plan A, this is plan B. The fact of the matter is the Jets, on some level, can't control this. You're going to have to take a leap of faith that the Jets are going to be able to get a quarterback, because you're not walking into a situation. You want to walk into a situation where you've got a quarterback in place, where you don't have to wonder who the quarterback's going to be. Because as much as the Jets can assure you we're going to get this guy, we're going to get that guy, you don't know it for sure until the Jets actually get him. And you're going to have to take the job before the Jets have their quarterback. So that's number one. Number two, which is a lesser but still an issue, this coaching staff is on the hot seat. Now, of course, you go in and fix the offense, they're going to be off the hot seat next year. So there's that element to it. But it's different from where this was 2 years ago, where you knew you were going to have some time to get things in order. You gotta hit the ground running this time. Now, that doesn't mean that the Jets are necessarily going to have a difficult time filling the role, but it also means that there are certain coaches who have other options, who might be comfortable with where they are. And, they may say, you know what, I don't want to take this chance going to the Jets right now. I like where I'm at. One of those coaches turned the Jets down for an interview yesterday. We'll talk about that coach. We'll talk about what this means. And we'll talk about a couple of the other candidates who could emerge as we close out this Thursday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Bar. We just got through the holidays, and your goal might be to eat a little bit healthier in the new year. And if you want to eat healthier, but you don't want to compromise taste, then I've got the thing for you. You got to try Built. With Built, healthy is actually tasty. They're so delicious that you won't believe they're good for you, and they're perfect for New Year's resolutions. What makes Built Bar so good? Well, for starters, they're all covered in 100% real chocolate. Yes, that's real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors. There's churro, there's peanut butter brownie, there's coconut almond, and somehow Built makes them healthy. There's only 130 calories in most bars, 4 grams of sugar, and 17 grams of protein. And now you do not need to wait around to get a box. For years, we've been talking about ordering your Built Bars at Built.com. Well, you can do that still, but you can also go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club to get Built Bars. That's right, head to your nearest Walmart today, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built Bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. Or if you're close to Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with hit flavors brownie batter and churro. You can thank me later. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. Here on this Thursday, we're talking Jets offensive coordinator candidates. The search goes on. One candidate we can cross off the list is Darrell Bevell, a veteran offensive coordinator in the NFL. Stints with Minnesota, with Detroit, with Jacksonville, and most famously with the Seattle Seahawks, where he worked with Russell Wilson. He's worked with an impressive group of quarterback names, from Trevor Lawrence to Matthew Stafford to Russell Wilson again, to even Brett Favre back in his Minnesota days. But Bevell is out. He declined interviews from both the Jets and the Washington Commanders. So it's not like he just said to the Jets, I'm not interested in you. It sounds like he's interested. It sounds like he's just happy with where he is. He's with the Miami Dolphins. He's their quarterback's coach. It seems like a good situation for him. So Bevell's out. Again, I think the situation also plays into it too. Washington's situation's a bit unsettled as well as the Jets are. So again, it's not like the Jets are necessarily going to be in a situation where nobody wants the job. But there are probably going to be some candidates, given the circumstances, that might not want to take it because as far as NFL coordinator jobs go, this one's relatively unattractive. And listen, an unattractive NFL coordinator job is still pretty attractive because you still get to run an NFL offense. But you might have a smaller selection of candidates who are interested, and that's where the Jets are in. And the Jets, of course, can land a very good candidate. And there are all sorts of candidates who have emerged. One of them is a guy I'm not really sure what to think about. And once we get into like these position coaches, I told you about Brian Johnson, but I think it's difficult to evaluate some of the other ones. There's one, Nick Caley, who is the Patriots tight ends coach. And this is an interesting one because Josh McDaniels apparently wanted to hire him for the Raiders staff last year. And Bill Belichick said no, he would not let Nick Caley go. What was interesting, though, is that with McDaniels left, there was a vacancy at the offensive coordinator job for the Patriots. And Belichick did not promote this guy. And instead, Belichick went with Matt Patricia and Joe Judge. Now, you could say, well, that's a red flag if Belichick did not promote Caley, the offensive coordinator. My counter to that would be Belichick made a big mistake. He went with Matt Patricia and with Joe Judge. Don't need to tell you about those two guys if you followed the NFL in recent years. That asking these guys, neither of whom had run an offense before. At least neither of whom would run a successful offense in the NFL in the case of Joe Judge. I don't need to tell you that was a bit of a shaky decision on Belichick's part. Belichick's a great coach. He's obviously going to the Hall of Fame, one of the great coaches ever, but he makes some big mistakes from time to time, and that seems to be one of them. Now it sounds like his contract is up this year. Would he come to the Jets? I think it would be an interesting choice. Again, a guy who, on some level, two teams that were interested in him last year, so on that level, I guess it would be an intriguing hire. The one thing that makes me a little bit nervous, though, is this Patriots offense can be very complex. So, and sometimes what you see is these Patriots assistants, they go elsewhere, and they don't have the same level of success because you don't have Tom Brady running this intricate offense, and they're hesitant to simplify things. And this is true. This is true when Belichick assistants go and take head coaching jobs, but it's also been true in spots where they've taken assistant coaching jobs, where they've taken coordinator positions, is that they try and do everything the Belichick way, and it doesn't work. And one of the reasons the offense doesn't work is that it's very intricate, and a lot of quarterbacks, if you don't have Tom Brady, sometimes you have to simplify the system a little bit, but these guys want to run it exactly the way New England runs it, and you run into trouble that way. Now, as I mentioned, a couple other candidates off the Philadelphia coaching tree have also interviewed. One is Kevin Patullo, a guy who, I don't know what to think about him, but a guy who does have some experience with the Jets. So I think having worked with the Jets before is a good thing for any coach who's taking a high-profile job like a head coach or a coordinator position, because this is kind of a unique situation. This is a very intense media market. It's a very intense fan base. So at least you have some idea what you're getting yourself into. Outside of that, I think it's difficult to say. I mean, this would just be one where you'd have to wait and see. I think the same would be true of Marcus Brady, again, the former Colts offensive coordinator. Not that impressive this year, but didn't really have a lot to work with the Colts. And I think Marcus Brady's kind of an interesting candidate from the standpoint that he spent a lot of time working in Canada in the CFL. He actually, in his playing days, he was a CFL player. The game is different in Canada. The field is wider. It's actually a 110-yard field. The field is there's more distance between the sidelines, and you have 3 downs instead of 4 downs in Canada, and it's 12 on 12. So somebody from Canada, I'm always intrigued by like guys who have ties to Canadian football, because I think it gives you a different perspective, and maybe you can bring in ideas. Now, what those ideas would be, anybody's guess. But I think having a perspective of scheming for what's actually a different game, I think maybe that could bring fresh ideas to an NFL offense. Although the record of Canadian coaches coming to the NFL or CFL coaches coming to the NFL is rather mixed, so it's difficult to say. But these are candidates who I think it's difficult to have a strong opinion on, because you don't really have that great of a body of work on them to really know what they're capable of doing. And that's one of the challenges, especially when we're talking about coordinator candidates, is that their skills are not on display on a weekly basis the way a player's skills are, especially when we're talking position coaches, because you're kind of going based on what their position group did, but that's not always a result of coaching. Sometimes it's just about the player's ability. Sometimes it's just about luck. So we'll see what happens with the Jets offensive coordinator search. It sounds like more names will emerge on the radar in the days ahead, and we'll talk about them on future episodes. But that's all for today. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please a big thumbs up for this episode. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.